Thanks to everybody for coming here, and good afternoon. My name is Mac DeFord. That's Tom DeMarco over there. This is the 7th year we've done a presentation of this kind for the Camden Conference. Now, those of you who are, those are our advertisers. Those of you who are familiar with our format, which is usually subtitled 100 Years in 100 Minutes, the last year it was 1,000 years in 100, and this year it's 100 days.
Times are tough.
Times are tough. 100 days, but not a problem. It's always 100 minutes, and certainly today it will be no longer than 100 minutes. Anyway, it's an aspect. What we do is we take an aspect of history which relates to, or theoretically relates to, the Camden Conference. Anyway, that was the original concept. Last year's conference was entitled, "The U.S. in the 21st Century, Do We Have What It Takes?" And Tom and I use that as a springboard to review 1,000 years of Roman history, focusing primarily on the decline and fall, so it wasn't that far-fetched. This year, the conference, entitled "The Middle East, What Next?" will focus on the aftermath of the Arab Spring. An obvious opportunity, we thought, for a look back at one of the key events of our own revolutionary springtime, the furious presidential election of 1800, pitting President John Adams against his own vice president, for things were a little different in those days. And perhaps this look into the early days of our revolutionary history will help illuminate what's ahead in the Arab world as their spring descends into winter. Or perhaps not. Anyway, it's now just a few days before the furious election of 2012. So if nothing else, what we talk about today will provide additional support for that old truism, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Or as they say in Arabic, mittel ma rutti, mittel ma jieti, which at least, and probably for the last time, brings us back to the subject of this year's Camden Conference. But in any case, before we get into the details of 1800, let's get a little historical perspective. 18th century America was probably closer to 1st century Rome than it is to 21st century America. There was no electricity, obviously no telephones in 1800. Samuel F.B. Morse's famous first telegram, "What hath God wrought?" And the answer in 1800, nothing yet. It wasn't sent till 1844, more than 40 years after the election we're talking about. In 1800, the horse and the sailing ship were the fastest means of travel. That famous American invention, Robert Fulton's first commercially viable steamship, made its maiden voyage from Albany to New York in 1807. It didn't exist in 1800. The first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, was not inaugurated until 1828, nearly 3 decades after the election we're going to be talking about. It wasn't even on the drawing boards in 1800. Needless to say, there were no cars at the birth of our nation. The real problem was more fundamental. There were no roads either. In 1800, John Adams took more than 2 weeks to travel the 450 miles from Boston to the newly established capital in Washington. By contrast, the Romans had 50,000 miles of paved roads, and horse-drawn carriages could travel from Naples to Milan, which was also about 450 miles, in less than half the time it took Adams to go the same distance 15 centuries later. So it's important to keep in mind, as Tom and I take you through some of the early days of our history, 212 years ago, that things were different then. The physical world in which people lived was very, very different. But then you will see, and this of course is the reason we're presenting this the 2 days before our own elections, is that some things, human nature, human behavior, and electoral politics have remained pretty much the same, or perhaps even improved slightly. But judge for yourself.
Our story takes place in 1800, sliding a little bit forward into 1801. But I am going to begin us by flashing forward to July 3rd, 1826, the day before the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And come with me to a certain mountaintop retreat just south and east of present-day Charlottesville, Virginia. This is Thomas Jefferson's famous Monticello. Monticello, in Monticello, on this day, Thomas Jefferson is on his deathbed. He has been bedridden since March. His grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, arrives from Tufton, Virginia, nearby. Now he is, this is an early picture of him. He is now Jefferson's doctor. He's Dr. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the only one that Jefferson will allow to attend to him. And he arrives and comes in through the front porticos, these ornate porticos, and through the magical Jefferson doors. Have you seen these? You open one and the other one opens by itself, all built in Thomas Jefferson's design. Underneath the Jefferson clock, you see it up there, that tells not only the time but also the date. And as he goes through the entry room, he passes between two busts that are face to face with each other. One is of Jefferson himself. It is a proof of the famous Houdon Jefferson bust given to him as a gift by the artist. And opposite, a bust of his arch enemy, Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson has left instructions that even after he's gone, he wants these two statues to be face to face to call attention to the idea that they are opposed in death as in life, that they are enemies and will always be enemies. The doctor passes through the parlor, and into the famous alcove bedroom, which has got a dressing room on one side and Jefferson's study on the other side. And there he finds Thomas Jefferson, barely awake, barely able to speak. He's 83 years old. He is on his very last legs, holding on for the 4th of July, for the 50th anniversary of the signing. As he looks out on his study, the thing closest to his bed is a statue of his old friend, John Adams. His old friend and one-time enemy. Their friendship has been destroyed by the election. And then friends again. In the years, in their dotage, in their latter years, Adams has reestablished connection after a dozen years of not speaking to each other. He writes to Jefferson in 1812, you and I need to explain ourselves to each other before we die. And thus begins a reestablishment of the friendship that goes on for another, the explaining goes on for another 14 years and creates one of the beautiful correspondences in our language. His last words, Jefferson's last words are, is this the 4th? He actually says it late on the evening of the 3rd, and the doctor says, hang on. And Jefferson does. He dies at 12:50 on the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. Meanwhile, some 600 miles away in Quincy, Massachusetts, John Adams is also dying on this very day, on the 4th of July. He is in his estate called Peacefield, and he, by the way, Adams dies with money. Of all the principals of our story, they all die broke. I mean, Jefferson lives in the great house, but he's broke. Monroe, Madison, Hamilton, they all die broke, except for Adams. He hasn't made any money as president, but he's done some nice land deals, and he leaves an estate of more or less the equivalent of today of $1 million. His doctor comes in through the famous stone library, and he encounters Adams in his bed. He's 90 years old. He's awake. He's conscious. He's as persnickety as ever, crockety as ever. And he says, the doctor says to him, it is the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declarations. And Adams responds, it's a great day. It's a good day. He lasts another 5 or 6 hours from that point. He actually dies at 6:40 p.m. His very last words are, Thomas Jefferson survives. Now, he's wrong. Jefferson has predeceased him by only a few, he had died earlier that morning. This is part of the cast of characters, but not nearly the whole cast of characters of our drama.
So let's look now at the complete cast of characters who are key to our story. Joseph Ellis, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, entitled his history of the period "The Founding Brothers." But as we shall see, brotherly love was not the glue that held them together. Now, Jefferson and Adams were indeed very close. At least they were when they were working together in France as envoys in the late 1780s. But a decade later, with Adams as president, and now the two on different sides of the political spectrum, they had a serious falling out. Now, keep this in mind. The green means friendship, the green arrows. The yellow mean enmities. This chart's going to get much more complicated.
Well, talk about enmities. When we bring Alexander Hamilton into the picture, we have something that's not just an enmity, but it's a hatred. They actually, both of them in their writing, refer to the relationship between them in terms of hatred, and they call each other enemies. Adams doesn't love Alexander Hamilton either. At one point, he calls him the bastard son of a Scotch peddler. No love lost there.
Now, how about the founding father, George Washington? Where did he fit in? Washington had great affection and admiration for Hamilton, who had been his aide-de-camp during the Revolutionary War. Indeed, it was said at the time that Hamilton was like a son to Washington. When he became president, Washington appointed Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was Washington's closest advisor, and Washington continued to rely on him throughout his 2 terms as president. But few of the key players in our story, as you will see, held Hamilton in the same high regard.
James Madison had a very close relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Madison is 7 years younger. They meet in 1776, in October of that year, right after the signing of the Declaration. And they established the beginnings of a friendship, but it really begins to mature and blossom when Jefferson comes back from France to become vice president. Madison at this point is what we would today call Speaker of the House. And you know, because he's younger, because he's 7 years younger, a lot of historians think that maybe he was just an acolyte to Jefferson. But you could make the opposite case, that Madison was the more philosophical of the pair. And as Jefferson falls under his wing, his own ideas start to change. And that's when the estrangement begins from John Adams, because the ideas of Madison are inconsistent with those of Adams. And Jefferson is very much in his camp. Washington also comes to depend enormously on James Madison. He asks him, when he's inaugurated for the very first presidency of our history, he asks Madison to write his farewell address for him, and Madison does that. When he decides to retire at the end of his first term, he doesn't actually do that, but he does just think he's going to retire in 1792. He asked Madison to write his farewell address, and Madison does draft the farewell address, and that's pretty much what Washington uses 4 years later. Not entirely, as we'll see, that Hamilton had a little stake in it as well. But Washington and Madison, in this period, very close.
And then there's Aaron Burr, a close friend of James Madison since their college days together at Princeton. Burr had been a Revolutionary War hero, but Washington didn't trust him, nor, as we shall see, did Jefferson, who came to detest him and eventually, in fact, had him tried for treason.
James Monroe. Now, you might think Monroe doesn't come into this at all in 1800, that he's a president 16 years later, but he's actually a player at this point. He has been American ambassador to France, he has been a U.S. senator, and he is presently the governor of Virginia, and he has a role to play here. He and Hamilton detest each other. Hamilton has challenged him to a duel. Monroe goes to his friend Aaron Burr and asks him to be his second. And Burr goes to Hamilton. They're fairly close at this point. They're practicing law together. He goes to Hamilton and arranges for the whole thing to be put aside with a half-hearted set of apologies on both sides, so there's no duel. But Monroe and Hamilton remain implacable enemies through to the end. Washington and Monroe are also not on good terms. Well, this is kind of one way. Monroe hates Washington. Washington doesn't care, but he has brought Monroe back in disgrace from being the U.S. ambassador to France, and Monroe never forgets that.
Now, if there were remarkable men in those days, there were remarkable women too. Dolly Madison was, of course, James's vivacious wife. She was a widow when a mutual friend, Aaron Burr, introduced the two. She was later asked by Thomas Jefferson, who had been widowed early in his life, to act as his hostess and first lady during Jefferson's 8 years as president. Now, we all know now that Jefferson had had a nearly 2-decade-long affair with Sally Hemings, his black slave, going back to his Paris days. It's hardly surprising that Jefferson picked Dolly, not Sally, to act as his first lady. Abigail Adams was a close confidant in politics as well as everything else to husband John. And she was also, from their Paris days, a close friend and over the years a frequent correspondent with Thomas Jefferson. But she, like almost everyone else in this picture, except Washington, couldn't abide Alexander Hamilton.
Now, some of these are minor likes and dislikes, and others are honest-to-God, bosom buddies, and hatreds. So let me thicken up some of the arrows to show the ones that really matter, and focus on those, because these are the relationships and the tensions that create the drama for this story.
Okay. Now, do you have all that? Even if you haven't been able to keep track of the friendships and enmities of our early heroes, you may have noticed that, ironically, the only two who ended up in a fatal duel, Hamilton and Burr, didn't really hate each other. We don't have the yellow arrows joining them. Though political foes, they were longtime law partners, winning their last case together just 4 years before Burr shot Hamilton. Indeed, even a week before the duel, they were at a dinner party where Burr toasted his old friend Hamilton. Such was life in 1800, in some aspects perhaps not so different from the way it is now. But let's delve into a little bit more detail of the men that made those that first generation of Americans.
A very quick pass over the life of John Adams. He's a Harvard student. He is a young, fiery revolutionary and lawyer in Braintree, Massachusetts. He becomes the heart and soul of the Continental Congress, causing the Declaration to be written and getting everybody to sign it. He becomes Vice President of the United States, a president as well, and finally an elder statesman. If I were to impress only one thing on you about John Adams, it would be his energy. The man had phenomenal energy. He starts off in Quincy, Braintree at that time, Massachusetts, and in an era when the average American never leaves, from birth to death, never leaves the county in which he's born. Adams is a traveler. He gets sent down to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in 1774, and it takes him 11 days to get there. 11 days. It takes him 4 days to cross Connecticut, and then 11 days back. I have no idea what route he used, but 11 days to get back. And then the next Continental Congress in 1775 is in Baltimore, and it takes him, I don't know, more than 11 days to get there and back. And then he's off to France to become one of our envoys to the French. And I'm going to show this very quickly, moving across the Atlantic. That was too quickly. Very quickly moving across the Atlantic, but it actually takes them 47 days to cross the Atlantic. Midwinter, he starts on February 13th. He arrives on April 1st, 47 days across the frozen Atlantic. He arrives at Bordeaux, and then on to Paris, and then back again the next winter. Again, a winter crossing, back across the Atlantic, and then back again to France. This time he's shipwrecked off of Spain. He comes across the Pyrenees on a mule. Imagine the portly John Adams crossing the Pyrenees on the mule. And then up to Holland to negotiate one loan or another, and back to Paris for the signing of the treaty, ending the revolution, an honorable peace. and then up to Great Britain, to London, to become our first ambassador, the United States' first ambassador to Great Britain, and then back to the United States, where his real travels began, because now he's vice president. The capital is at first in New York, and he goes back and forth, and then the capital moves to Philadelphia, and he makes 8 trips back and forth to Philadelphia, and then the capital moves to Washington, and he makes 2 more round trips. I figure 30,000 miles, all of it at 4 miles an hour, more or less 4 miles an hour. During the period I've just related, everything has changed. I mean, think about it. You've gone from being a backwater, a colony of Great Britain, a putrid economy where nothing works, with no money of our own. This period, all the way through to Adams' presidency, up to 1800, this is exactly the period that Rip Van Winkle sleeps through. Rip Van Winkle goes to sleep in 1774, wakes up in 1797, 98, something like that, in Adams' presidency. And we think of this story as about going to sleep in one era and waking up in another, but that's not what Washington Irving had in mind. What he wanted to tell us about was the great difference between the United States in 1774 and the United States in 1796. And John Adams had a hand in every single bit of it. From the very beginning, when he is at the Continental Congress, he comes up with the key crystallizing phrase, the rallying cry of the Revolution. This is his quote. And in 4 words, it says it all about why we're rebelling against the United States, against Great Britain. He is the one who brings Washington in to run what had before been a regional dispute, Massachusetts against the Brits. When he brings Washington in, he brings in Virginia, and it becomes a national matter. That is the now United States, the colonies rebelling, all of them rebelling against Great Britain. Adams is quick to understand about the Continental Congress that the plenary sessions are all hot air, that they talk and talk, but they never ever decide anything. What the real action is in the committees. And he is on a dozen different committees, including the committee for the Declaration of Independence with Franklin and Jefferson. It's Adams who has the inspired idea to allocate to Jefferson the task of writing the first draft, which is more or less the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. But more important, it's Adams who persuades everybody to sign on. 57 Americans put their lives on the line by signing the Declaration of Independence. The actual moment of the signing is a triumph for both Jefferson and Adams. As David McCullough says, Jefferson is the pen of the Revolution, but John Adams was its voice. He was a spectacular speaker. Jefferson tells about him at this time. He says he was a colossus. His words lifted the hearers from their seats, that he is the voice of the Revolution. Off to France to negotiate for money and for military support, and then finally back to France again to be the signer, the negotiator of the honorable peace with Great Britain that ends the Revolution and makes the United States an independent country, acknowledged by the Brits. Now think about that. He's 53 years old. Everything he's touched has turned to gold. Everything he's tried to do, he accomplished. He's golden here. But that's it for him. From now on, it's all downhill. He has 8 horrible years as vice president, taking the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Adams, the eloquent speaker, is not allowed to speak. You know, an issue comes up and they're debating it, and he says, well, here's what I think about that. And everybody says, you're not allowed to speak here. You're just the president pro tem. You call on us and tell us which one has the floor, but you're not allowed to express your own opinion. He then becomes our mediocre second president and suffers the indignity of being the first U.S. president to be turned out of office after only a single term. All of that a fairly glum end of the career, and he's very bitter about it. He realizes he's peaked early, and everything from that date on is a sad aftermath. So remember him not as our mediocre second president, but as this wonderful, fiery orator, the voice of the revolution, the muse of the Declaration, a diplomat, negotiator, and one of our founding fathers.
In 1962, at a dinner honoring that year's Nobel Prize winners, President Kennedy said, "There has never been such a collection of intellectual power in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Jefferson was born in 1743, a child, as Kennedy's quote well expresses, of the Enlightenment. The end of the 18th century, when Thomas Jefferson immortalized himself at the birth of our new nation by authoring the Declaration of Independence, was the beginning of decades of revolution, first in America, then in France, and ultimately throughout continental Europe. But these revolutionary outbreaks, these wars, were the outgrowth of an intellectual revolution, the Enlightenment, a revolution in religion, philosophy, science, politics, society itself, whose roots can be traced as far back as the early 17th century, with the writings of Francis Bacon, the first modern scientist, John Locke, the father of classical liberalism, Isaac Newton and the law of gravity, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the key political philosopher of his day, Thomas Paine, whose writings so influenced our own revolution. Preeminently, of all our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson was the embodiment of the Enlightenment. Jefferson was the most revolutionary in thought of all our first great Americans, though perhaps the most contradictory. His was a classical education. Sent away from home when he was only 9 years old, he studied Latin, Greek, French, as well as science, math, natural philosophy, rhetoric, ethics. Elected to the Virginia legislature when he was 25, the first bill he proposed was to make it legal for a slave owner in Virginia to free his slaves. At the time, that was illegal. Jefferson's bill was voted down. His attitude towards slavery was certainly his biggest contradiction. In those early days, he denounced slavery as, quote, an infamous practice, insisting that its abolition was, quote, the great object of desire for the colonies. As a 27-year-old lawyer, he defended a black slave seeking his freedom with the argument, under the law of nature, all men are born free. He lost the case, but the interesting thing, obviously, is that this sentiment he was to repeat 5 years later when he authored the Declaration of Independence. But he first used it, Jefferson first used this concept in defense of a black slave. His history with Sally Hemings begun in the years when he took her to Paris with him. I think she was 14 or 15 years old. Is now, of course, well known, so there's no need to get too deeply sidetracked, other than to notice the obvious irony in the fact that the author of the Declaration of Independence fathered, some people say, as many as 5 children by one of his own slaves. And his children, Jefferson's children, then grew up in his household as slaves. He was a deist who did not believe in the divinity of Christ, noting in a letter, quote, I am a Christian, sincerely attached to Christ's doctrines, ascribing to him every human excellence, and believing he never claimed any other. Could a man with such public beliefs be elected president today? To emphasize his belief in Jesus' philosophy, and only in his philosophy, he rewrote the New Testament. Well, why not? This was Thomas Jefferson, America's Renaissance man. In Jefferson's New Testament, he expunged all references to miracles or the supernatural. In accordance with his own unorthodox, certainly unorthodox views of Christianity for that time, he was an outspoken believer in the separation of church and state, authoring in his early days when he was serving in the Virginia Assembly the first bill of its kind. Our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than do our opinions of physics or geometry. The opinions of men are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. He founded the University of Virginia, and in keeping with his own philosophy, stipulated that religion should not be taught there except as part of ethics. And besides founding the university, he designed its original buildings, as indeed he had designed his own house at Monticello. But perhaps above all else about Jefferson was his belief in the need for constant change. Man was capable of improvement, of new and better ideas. Tying a current generation to ideas from previous ones was out of the question. The earth belongs always to the living generation. They may manage it then and what proceeds from it as they please. They're masters too of their own persons and consequently may govern them as they please. Strict constructionism, tying 21st century Americans to a 200-year-old Constitution, would have been a totally alien concept for Jefferson. On the other hand, the right to bear arms, though muskets were the state of the art in those days, to protect oneself from an unworthy government was something Jefferson would have readily agreed with. In a famous letter he wrote from Paris when he heard the news of Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts in 1787, this was an armed revolt which John Adams believed threatened the United States with anarchy. Jefferson concluded in his letter, "Let them take up arms. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of tyrants and patriots. It is its natural manure."
Well, you've heard what two amateur historians, Mac and Tom, have to say about Adams and Jefferson. Let's hear what a real pro has to say on the subject.
Jefferson was very contained, very restrained, did not want anybody to know what he truly felt, what kinds of passion was within or at odds with him, whereas Adams wore his emotions on his sleeve. Adams, who was very eloquent on his feet, a great speaker, a great convincer of juries and delegations at the Continental Congress. Jefferson, who couldn't speak on his feet to save his life, a terrible public speaker, but who could express himself on paper as few people ever have. And how they started off as friends and co-revolutionaries, ultimately became political rivals, even adversaries in a harsh fashion nearly, who didn't speak to each other for years, who in a way were responsible for the political divisions that set up our two-party system, and who then have a great reconciliation after each has served in the presidency and become great friends again, and correspondence, carrying on some of the most eloquent correspondence in our history and in our language, and who then incredibly, unimaginably, die on the same day, and the same day is the 4th of July, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which they created. Now, that doesn't happen in real life. That couldn't happen on the stage or in a movie because nobody would believe it, but it did.
Now, Adams and Jefferson are, of course, the heroes of our story of the election of 1800, but there are other key players. Let's start with Aaron Burr, because in many ways, Aaron Burr was a mysterious figure, perhaps the most ambiguous of all that generation of founding fathers. And I say generation of because no one considers Aaron Burr a founding father, and for a well-known reason, that his most famous moment came when he killed Alexander Hamilton on July 11, 1804, on the bluffs above the Hudson across from Manhattan. Burr, at the time, was Jefferson's vice president. Recent biographers, some refer to them as psycho-biographers, have concluded that Hamilton, who at the time, as Tom will get into later, his career was in tatters, and they have decided that Hamilton may actually have committed suicide using Burr as his instrument. After reading all the evidence, Joseph Ellis concluded, this is a quote from one of his books, Hamilton did fire his weapon intentionally, and he did fire first, but he aimed to miss Burr, sending his ball into the tree above and behind Burr. Burr did know that a projectile from Hamilton's gun had whizzed past him and crashed into the tree to his rear. According to the principles of the Dueler's Code, Burr was perfectly justified in taking deadly aim at Hamilton and firing to kill. But did he? What is possible, Ellis writes, but beyond the reach of the available evidence, is that Burr really missed his target too, that his own fatal shot, in fact, was accidental. Whatever either meant to do, Burr's shot killed Hamilton and killed Burr's career as well, which until then had been a highly successful one. Burr's father was a noted theologian and the president of what was to become Princeton College. His mother was the daughter of the legendary evangelical minister Jonathan Edwards. Despite these influences from both sides of his family, Burr, like Jefferson, was famously ambivalent when it came to Christianity. On his deathbed, when asked by a clergyman, and the clergyman happened to be his first cousin, if he wished to seek God's pardon through Jesus Christ, Burr replied, and remember, this is on his deathbed, "On that subject, I'm coy." He graduated from Princeton with a BA when he was only 16, studied law for a few years, and then joined the Continental Army right after Concord and Lexington. He was something of a war hero, taking part in Benedict Arnold's famous expedition up the Kennebec, then beyond the wilds of northern Maine, and they were really wild in those days, to Quebec, where on New Year's Eve, 1775, the U.S. forces suffered a major defeat, during which General Montgomery, our commanding general, was killed. Burr distinguished himself in the battle and was one of the few American soldiers to escape unharmed. He was later the hero of the Army's retreat from Lower Manhattan after the British had landed behind the American forces. Burr was promoted to colonel when he was 21, but despite his outstanding war record, he never gained the confidence of George Washington, who at one point was quoted as saying, "By all that I have heard and known, Colonel Burr is a brave and able officer, but the question is whether he has equal talents at intrigue." Who knows exactly what prompted Washington's remark, but if he had known of it, it might have been a comment Burr made to his friend at the time, Alexander Hamilton, in which he said, and the two were speaking French apparently, defending some proposal that Burr had made to Hamilton, "Great souls don't sweat petty morality." After leaving the Army, Burr resumed his studies and began practicing law in New York City. He built up a highly profitable practice so that in 1790, he was able to buy a magnificent estate, Richmond Hill House, which incidentally had served George Washington as his headquarters during the Revolutionary War. Burr had known Hamilton during the war, remained friends, often dining together over the years, and indeed they collaborated on several law cases. Though by the mid-1790s, Burr was firmly established in the Republican camp, and Hamilton was the leading Federalist in New York. Burr served in the New York State Assembly for a year, became the Attorney General for New York State, and in 1791 was elected to the United States Senate. And after, as we shall see, playing the key role in getting Jefferson elected president in 1800, Burr served as his vice president. Following his disgrace as a result of the duel with Hamilton, he was involved in various intrigues, to use Washington's word, involving the Western territories, which led to his actually being tried for treason by President Jefferson, for whom, remember, Burr had served as his vice president during Jefferson's first term. Burr eventually died in relative obscurity at the age of 80. Now, I'll close with this brief picture of our third vice president with one coincidental anecdote, personal anecdote. At a dinner party in Santiago, Chile, in the early 1980s, about 30 years ago, I was introduced to, and I believe his first name was Antonio Burr, a descendant of Aaron. Because after his disgrace, after Burr's disgrace, a Burr nephew had moved to South America to escape the notoriety, and the family has remained there quite successfully. In fact, it was one of Chile's leading families over the last 2 centuries.
I'm going to take Madison and Hamilton together because they constitute the two poles of the political system in 1800, and in a way, the two poles of the political system today as well. They agreed on some things, but as Hamilton's biographer, Forrest MacDonald, said, that they differed on what the role of government ought to be. Part of it they agreed on, that was Madison's contention, that the most important roles, that the essential roles of government are to protect the liberty of the people and the security of them in their persons and their property. This Hamilton ascribed to fully. But Madison would leave it there. He was the Ron Paul of his day. Limited government. That is what government exists for. Liberty and security, period, end of equation. Hamilton had a much more expansive view. As MacDonald says, he added 3 additional ends of government. First of all, providing for the great purposes of commerce, revenue, and agriculture. Thus, the need for a national bank to enable the economy to work well enough for the standard of living to rise. 2, facilitating domestic tranquility and happiness, thus the beginnings of a safety net to make sure that everybody has a stake in the continued stability of the United States. And finally, establishing sufficient stability and strength to make us respectable abroad. The ability to be a player on the international stage. So you can see that here we have the Ron Paul of the day and an FDR Democrat. And this was the tension between Jefferson and Adams in the election. It was the tension between the ideas of Madison and the ideas of Hamilton. And if it doesn't sound familiar to you today, you're missing something about what's going on in our country, because it's still true. This is the big distinction between our 2 political spheres today. Each was a titan in his own right. Madison was not just a founder, but in one sense he was the founder. He was the one who had the vision that the others put into place and caused to happen. He was the one who wrote the Constitution. He arrives in 1787 in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. He arrives with a draft in his pocket. It's called the Virginia Plan, and it is the Constitution. It's the Constitution. I mean, we had all kinds of people stood up and said, well, I've got a different idea, but they finally adopted Madison's idea of the Constitution. He is the inventor out of whole cloth. There'd never been anything like it before in history, of the system of checks and balances, of the separation of the powers, of this notion of individual rights, which are the sacred duty of government to protect. All of that is Madison. He is the author of the Bill of Rights. Everybody said we ought to have a Bill of Rights, but what are the rights that go in there? And Madison was the one who wrote the Bill of Rights. Hamilton was a similar overachiever. He is the designer of American government. Madison gave us the underlying body of law, but there are all kinds of questions about how do we govern ourselves? How many departments are there? How do they interact? What roles and responsibilities? What budgets? Now, you might think that Washington, the chief executive, would be on top of this, but no, he hasn't got a clue. He's a military guy. He, in fact, immediately after his inauguration, leaves town and goes on a 2-month travel around New England, leaving Hamilton to form the government. And Hamilton does that. He puts in place the entire United States government, all of the departments, all of the roles, all of the responsibilities, and all of the budgets. He has this notion, because he's an Anglophile, that the role of the chief executive ought to be divided in 2. Think about Great Britain. It's got a figurehead, that's George III, and then a decision maker, that's William Pitt, who is the prime minister. And in Hamilton's view, and in Washington's, they would have a similar partitioning, where Washington would be the George III and Hamilton would be the William Pitt. And they did exactly that. Washington accepted that. Again, because he's a delegator, he doesn't know what to do himself, he doesn't know how to form a government, but Hamilton does. At various times, he is the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, the de facto Secretary of State, the head of the government. The French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, had a great quote about Hamilton. Talleyrand knew them all. He knew He knew Adams and Jefferson when they were in France. He knew Monroe when he was American ambassador to France. He knew Madison later when he became Jefferson's Secretary of State. And during the Terror, when Talleyrand has to flee Paris, he comes to New York and he lives with Aaron Burr in Richmond House, and he spends all of his time with Alexander Hamilton. And of all of these, he had a particular affection for Hamilton. He said he was one of the 2 or 3 great men of our era. Now, if you know anything about Talleyrand, you know he also included himself in this group. So it's Talleyrand and Hamilton plus at most one other. I've called attention to the difference between them, the tension between them, but it's worth pointing out that they did an enormous amount together. They wrote 80 of the 85 Federalist Papers. Together, as partners, they were the ones that caused ratification of the Constitution to happen. They also participated in writing Washington's farewell address, because when Washington doesn't give it in 1792, and in 1796 he wants to give it, he takes the draft that Madison had given him, and he passes it to Hamilton, who rewrites it. So the final famous farewell address, Washington's famous farewell address, had 2 authors, Madison and Hamilton, not Washington. Washington had little or no role in that. Hamilton is the left. Madison is the right. And that's true today as much as it was then. When you hear a spokesman for the left or the right speaking today, he seems to be saying, you know, wouldn't it be nice if the other side kind of went away and we got to do things exactly our way? But as you look at these two, you think about, we needed them both, didn't we? I mean, to become the United States that we are today, we needed both of these ideas. We are the synthesis today of the ideas of Madison and Hamilton.
Now, if Jefferson was the Renaissance man, Adams the voice of the Revolution, Hamilton, as we've seen, the brilliant financial engineer, Burr, the flamboyant renegade, Madison, the shy Virginian who authored the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, what is there to say about this guy, James Monroe? Well, as everybody knows, there's the Monroe Doctrine when he was president, but that's about 20 years down the road from our story. Monroe was the youngest of our early leaders, 15 years younger than Jefferson. In his early days, he had studied law under Jefferson, and as a result, became Jefferson's protege, which in and of itself is no mean accomplishment. His war record was such that 2 separate artists specifically included Monroe's likeness in paintings from when he accompanied General Washington at the Battle of Trenton, where Monroe was seriously wounded and subsequently promoted for gallantry. But if he was a disciple of Jefferson, he was an even more hardline Republican than Jefferson himself, more Catholic than the Pope, one might say, more pro-French as well than even Jefferson was. Jefferson, Monroe's ardent Francophile mentor. Monroe was stunned when he was minister in France under Washington, and the United States signed the Jay Treaty with London at the end of 1794, which signaled that Hamilton and his pro-English Federalists were the key foreign policy makers in Washington. In fact, Washington eventually had to recall Monroe from Paris because of what Washington thought was Monroe's pro-French leanings. Washington denounced him at the time for, quote, his disruptive manner and failure to safeguard his nation's interests. Pretty heavy stuff from the father of our country. Monroe was no pushover. As governor of Virginia, during the lengthy stalemate in the electoral tally in the election of 1800, when it looked as if Jefferson might in fact be cheated out of the presidency, Monroe threatened to call out the Virginia militia to assure a victory for Jefferson. But I'll stop here because that comes later in our story.
Now, we didn't figure the American electorate on our cast of characters, but obviously it is an actor that's important here. And the key thing about it is that it's changing, it has a changing nature. The birth rate in 1800 is, this is amazing, 7 live births per woman, the American birth rate. If we carried on at that rate, we'd have over 2 billion Americans today. We didn't. There's also a humongous influx of people from Europe. Europe is torn apart in the Napoleonic Wars, and we've got draft resistors and displaced persons and renegade writers. They're all flooding into the United States. Between 1780 and 1830, we experienced the largest population boom that's ever been seen in world history to this time. Now, were they all going to vote? Well, no, not quite. When Jefferson said all men are created equal, this is Burr's acid observation, what he really meant was all men are created equal except blacks, women, and people without property. Blacks aren't allowed to vote because they're slaves. Women aren't allowed to vote because they're women. That leaves white males, and most of them don't vote because they don't have any property. In fact, only 1% of the total population voted in 1788 because of property restrictions. But those property restrictions were gradually being phased out so that by 1828, you've got universal male, white male suffrage, and 12% of the total population votes in 1828. So what you have is the electorate is a widening slice of an expanding pie, and it's happening with a geometric rate of increase. It's so great that between 1796, when Adams was elected, and 1800, the election where he runs against Jefferson, the total number of voters, of people able to vote, is increased by a third. Now, who are these people that didn't vote in 1796 but were available to vote in 1800? They fall into three groups. And the three groups are young people, too young to vote in 1796, but of age in 1800. Foreigners, the flooding in people who have become citizens and now able to vote. And formerly propertyless people, still poor people, but who are enabled to vote because of the relaxation of the property restrictions. Now, here's the scary thing about those three groups. They vote as a block. They all vote anti-establishment. And the bad news here for Adams is that he's the establishment. He's the incumbent. He's the party of the rich. He's the party of the elite. You know, Hamilton is the most aristocratic of them all, the party of the elite. They all vote against the incumbent. And what was relevant in 1800 becomes more and more relevant as time goes on, which assures this expanding electorate, assures control of the anti-incumbent, anti-establishment party, the Republicans, for the next 40 years, all the way through to Andrew Jackson, through Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and 2 terms of Andrew Jackson. Now, in any election, any modern election, you might look at this and say, hey, how did the black vote break? How did the black vote break? Well, in 1800, you say, well, there was no black vote, and that's true and not true. Blacks were not allowed to vote, but it didn't mean there wasn't a black vote, because if you remember from your history book, that the number of electors per state is a function of the white population of the state plus, remember this, 3/5 of the black population. So that 3/5 is the black vote, not voted by black people, of course, but voted on their behalf by their kindly owners. Let's look at one of those states, Virginia. Virginia in 1800 has got 830,000 inhabitants. 336,000 of them are slaves, that's 39%. It has 21 electoral votes, so do the math. 21 electoral votes times 3/5 times 39%. 5 of their electoral votes are the black vote, voted by white people. That's the black vote. Virginia has 500,000 white people, and they have 21 electoral votes. Massachusetts has 500,000 white people, and they have 16 electoral votes. The difference is the black vote. And that's just Virginia. There's also North and South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, adding another 5. The black vote in the whole election is 10 electoral votes. Now keep that number in mind when you see how the election plays out.
Okay, now you've been given some brief bios of our founding fathers during the first decade of the Republic. though one, you might notice, has been conspicuously left out. George Washington, the founding father, whose ideas from the early days of his presidency had increasingly become an anachronism. Washington, whose great fear was partisanship. His aristocratic vision was one of elite consensus leadership. Partisanship he saw as the greatest threat to our newly acquired freedom. Partisanship, he was to warn in his farewell address, tends, quote, to put in place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party. But partisanship was inevitable, not because of mere ambition on the part of the players, though there was certainly that, but because of sincere and fundamental differences predating Washington's presidency over the very nature of government. A key example, the Hamilton-Madison split, which Thomas just talked about. The first major disagreement which brought partisanship to the fore under Washington's presidency, and in fact nearly brought down the brand new government, was the issue of Hamilton's proposal for a national bank. Its key purpose, the key purpose of the national bank would be to assume the debts dating back to the Revolutionary War of the individual states. And it set the stage for what one historian has called, quote, the most meaningful dinner party in American history, in which Thomas Jefferson was to oversee a compromise between Hamilton and James Madison, who was now the leader of the anti-Hamilton faction in the House. Congressional debate over the issue of the national bank had produced total legislative paralysis for the first time, but as you know, not for the last time. In June 1790, just 2 years after Washington was sworn in, with feelings about to explode, Jefferson happened to run into Hamilton on the streets of Lower Manhattan. In those days, they all lived near each other because New York City was the temporary capital. Jefferson invited Hamilton for dinner with Madison at Jefferson's nearby house, 57 Maiden Lane, which coincidentally 5 days ago after Hurricane Sandy was in fact underwater. In any case, Jefferson was to write Monroe the day of the dinner in anticipation of the deal he knew he had to reach, that without such a deal, the national government would, quote, burst and vanish, and the states separate to take care of themselves on their own. Jefferson found the idea of a national bank taking on debts of the individual states repulsive. That was his word. But despite his own obvious reservations, he persuaded Madison to withdraw his opposition to the bank in exchange for locating the new capital, Washington, D.C., on the shores of the Potomac bordering Virginia. While Jefferson was able to forge a compromise on this issue, the fierce debate and the antagonisms it created revealed that Washington's vision of a nonpartisan elite was an idealistic mirage. And as time will show you, Tom, please show us the rest. It didn't get any better as time went on.
American political parties are about to happen. Historians trace the actual moment of their happening to another important dinner party. Again, Jefferson is the host. This one takes place on the Schuylkill River because the capital has moved from New York to Philadelphia in the interim. On April 1st, 1791, in the house that Jefferson calls Monticello on the Schuylkill, his palatial digs. The reason he ends up broke is he lives so far beyond his means through his entire life. He is the host. The actual event happens because Washington has taken another one of his grand tours, this time to Georgia and the South. He's going to be gone for 3 months. He leaves the cabinet in charge. Now that means Jefferson, who is Secretary of State, Hamilton, who is Secretary of the Treasury, John Adams, who is Vice President, and someone who hasn't entered our story yet, but you'll know him, Maine's own General Henry Knox, who is the Secretary of War. Jefferson calls them all together for a cordial dinner There's nothing to negotiate here. They're just going to be working together, running the government as a team of 4. He wants them to sit down and enjoy themselves and get to know each other a little bit better. So here we see the 4 of them at dinner. This is not an actual photograph, but you get the idea. Jefferson is a famous host. He's famous for his French cuisine and for his French wines, not just the quality of the French wines, but also, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, the quantity of the French wines. And maybe that's the problem, because during the course of this particular dinner party, things go badly awry, and it ends up with an acrimonious dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton. A dispute over, well, the usual things, the national bank, big government versus limited government, all of Hamilton's ideas as opposed to Madison's ideas, which now Jefferson is bought into entirely. And both of them leave the party understanding that they can no longer be colleagues. They can no longer cooperate. They call each other from this point on enemies. Jefferson goes directly to Madison and tells him what's happened, and they decide to form the First Republican Party. A few weeks later, they leave on their famous trip to New York, the botanizing trip. Remember hearing about that? Madison and Jefferson go to New York, a walking tour of upstate New York to botanize, a naturalist tour. But in fact, what they're doing is meeting with Aaron Burr and Robert Livingston, going up to Albany to meet with Governor George Clinton. They're rallying what will become the Republican Party. So this is the genesis in 1791 of the Republican Party, the first political party in the United States. I think it's interesting to trace that party all the way down to today, to trace the evolution of the party. In fact, I'll go back a little bit before the election, before this period, and pick up right after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, because already after the Constitutional Convention, you've got 2 factions. They're not parties, but they're factions. Those are the ones that are pro-ratification of the Constitution and the ones that are anti-ratification, who would keep the Articles of Confederation and keep all the power in the states. I've color-coded them red and blue, where the color coding has to do with where do they think the bulk of the power ought to be, in the center, in the central government, or in the states, as it was in the constitutional, in the Articles of Confederation. They call themselves the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and that name, the Federalist, is carried on into the period after the formation of the first Republican Party. The blue party is the Federalists, the red party, Jefferson and Hamilton's party. They call themselves the Republicans. That's what they call themselves, but viewed from the other side, each has a different name for the other. The Republicans call the Federalists aristocrats, because they are the party of the elite. That's the Hamiltonian party over there. And the Federalists call the Republicans Democrats, which is a dirty word in 1800. It's a dirty word. They also use the term mobocrat, because think what's happening in France. The French Revolution has gone badly downhill. The government by the mob is the guillotine, the terror, and so forth. So the aristocrats on one side and the Democrats. The success of Jefferson in the election of 1800, and then the increasing success from that point on, largely due to the expanding electorate, means that the Republican Party grows and prospers, and the Federalist Party dies. They never have another president. They're replaced briefly by another pro-Hamilton party called the Whigs, and then that dies out as well. They change their Obviously, they change their color a little bit. They move toward the center. They begin to adopt Hamiltonian ideas. They change their name. By the time John Quincy Adams runs, he doesn't run as a Federalist, because the Federalist Party is gone. He runs as a Republican, but it's now called Republican Democrat. And under Jackson, it's called Democratic Republicans. The word Democrat is no longer a dirty word because of this expanding electorate, all these new voters. And then it eventually becomes the Democratic Party. When the present day Republican Party comes into being. It's an offshoot from the Democratic Party. So what we today call the Grand Old Party is in fact the brand new party, and what we call the Democratic Party is in fact the party originally called the Republican Party, founded by Madison and Jefferson. Let's attach some personalities to this. The key person of the pro-ratification group is James Madison, but his great partner is Alexander Hamilton. They worked together for ratification. Also on that side is George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Adams and Jefferson. They're off in France, but their hearts are with them. On the other side, you have James Monroe. This is the group that would keep the Articles of Confederation, not have a central government. James Monroe, George Mason, Patrick Henry, Governor George Clinton. These are the anti-federalists. When the election begins to happen in 1800, all the alliances change. Adams and Jefferson become the heart and soul of the Federalist Party, and the other three, what Burr calls the Virginia Junto, become the heart and soul of the Republican Party. And then during the election, you've seen this before, each side moves to its extreme, and then something surprising. Adams moves to the center. Adams moves to the center, and it should be a good move. I mean, this is what you're supposed to do. Move from the extreme to the center in order to win votes. It doesn't work at all at 1800. Everybody hates him and he loses. But that's where he is anyway. Whenever you've got political parties or factions, doesn't it seem that there's always one side or the other is willing to play the God card, right? Let's put the God card in here. Here's the God card. Originally, it's the anti-federalists who play the God card, because this is so surprising. The Constitution doesn't mention Jesus. What a mistake. So the anti-federalists are against the Constitution because it doesn't call attention to our Christian nationhood. And then during the election, the God card moves to the other side because Jefferson is an atheist. Or at least they say he's an atheist. We can't have that. And then it moves to the center, and then somehow it goes to the right. I'm not quite sure why, but there it is today. How about the money card? Here's the money card. Originally with the Federalists, because the central government is good for trade, no interstate tariffs, stable government, centrally controlled, the party of the rich, essentially, moves down into the Federalists because of Hamilton's National Bank, easy credit, good pro-business government, and then briefly into the Whig Party, and then it too goes to the other side. For some reason it's not too clear. How about the Southern card? And the big government card? Well, these two, stay pretty much on their regular side. So here we have, the GOP has more cards than the other. I'm not sure what that means, but anyway. Okay, so back to 1800. We have the election now with Adams having moved to the center. One of the things that both Mac and I and David McCullough mentioned is that Adams and Jefferson had a great friendship that somehow got ruined during the course of the election. So that's what we call the rupture, and Mac's going to tell you about the rupture.
Now, going into the election of 1800, there were a number of issues that divided, as you've seen, the two, by now, very distinct parties, the Federalists and the Republicans. There was the overriding philosophical issue of big government and the taxes that big government implied. Then there was, of course, the original problem of the National Bank, which to the Republicans, even though they had compromised on it, was a prime example of big government run amok. Worst of all, from the Republican point of view, were the Alien and Sedition Acts, which Adams' Federalist Party in Congress had passed in 1798. Now, Adams, as president, had not proposed these acts, but he nonetheless signed them into law. The Alien Act gave the president the right to expel any foreigner he considered, quote, dangerous. It was clearly aimed at the French emigre population, which had grown rapidly and which supported the Republican Party. Jefferson, and remember he was Adams' vice president at the time, Jefferson publicly condemned the act as worthy of the 9th century, not the 19th century. But much worse, both from Jefferson's viewpoint as well as that of his Republican Party, was the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act, which was passed also in 1798, stated that, quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the President, or any attempt to excite against them the hatred of the good people of the United States, are crimes punishable by fine and imprisonment. Now, note that while the act created by the Federalist Congress specifically forbade any written attacks against Congress or the President, it conspicuously left unprotected the Vice President. This wasn't a coincidence. The Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, was the leader of the rival Republican Party. Bad enough, but the real problem from Jefferson's point of view was that the act was such an obvious violation of the guarantee of free speech in the First Amendment. Its clear intent was to shut down opposition Republican newspapers. And indeed, virtually all of the 17 arrested and tried under the Sedition Acts were Republicans. Jefferson was furious. It was not just because it was so obviously aimed at controlling his party's press. It was philosophically against everything he believed in. And it was the cause of the rupture of Adams and Jefferson's decades-long friendship.
Why blacken your fragile reputation by an assault on the freedoms for which we both fought? Do you intend to ship out the entire French population of the United States? Along with any other luckless soul who happens to voice a contrary opinion?
Well, if that contrary opinion threatens to divide the nation at a time when we must stand united, then yes, I will do just that. I'm entrusted with the nation's safety, Thomas. These war measures will protect us from insurrection and subversion.
There is no war.
And that is the principle behind these measures, the prevention of war.
Cannot protect the nation by attacking the right of every man to speak freely without fear. You're trampling on the Constitution. The states will have no alternative but to resist these measures, which are an assault on the liberty of their people.
The people's representatives demanded these acts. Would you have me deaf to the voice of the people? You are the president of the Senate, Thomas. Surely you will respect the wishes of the majority, as I did.
I cannot preside over a reign of witches. I shall remove myself to Monticello.
That is your privilege. I do not have such a luxury.
And that's exactly what Jefferson did. The Vice President of the United States packed up and went home to Monticello for 6 months. From there, he wrote his friend and Republican colleague James Madison that if necessary, Jefferson said he was determined, remember, always the revolutionary, to, quote, sever ourselves from the union we so much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government. But if over a dozen Republican newspapers were indeed closed as a result of the Sedition Act, and his signing it into law was to forever blot Adams' reputation, the fact is, newspapers in those days were uniformly partisan and uniformly outrageous.
We had more newspapers per capita in 1790 than any other country on earth. And the total number of newspapers between 1790 and 1800 doubles. And they are all newspapers only in the same sense that Fox News is a news channel. I mean, it's no news, just all opinion. And even opinion is a little bit too kind to them. Mostly it's invective and completely unsupported assertion. For instance, this is a banner that runs in the Gazette of the United States, a Federalist rag, through 2 months prior to the election. The grand question stated, God and a religious president, that's Adams, or Jefferson and no God. This idea that Jefferson is an atheist. He's not an atheist, he's a deist. He could tell you the difference, but he doesn't get a chance to. This is proof by repeated assertion, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Ad hominem attack without limit. Reason Magazine, the staff of Reason Magazine, a political satire magazine, has taken the worst of the outrageous statements out of the election of 1800 and put them into the form of a mock television ad. So here's here's what you would have seen on your television in 1800 if you'd been there and if you'd had one, that comes from the Republican side.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson. I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, unappreciable character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
Of course, the Federalists gave as good as they got. So here's the Federalist ad.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch feather.
You know, all of those are absolute direct quotes from the Republican or Federalist press of the day. I wanted to, Philadelphia alone has got 4 of these rags, 2 Federalists and 2 Republican. And the star journalist, the one who is the most outrageous of all, is a man named James Thompson Callender. We have, unfortunately, no surviving image of Callender, which is too bad because I wanted you to be able to visualize him. So I've just picked a face kind of at random. And that I thought, you know, he would look something like this. So this is Callender, and he's the one that's responsible for the great quote, John Adams is a hideous hermaphroditical character without the force and firmness of a man or the gentleness of a woman. But he also is the one who brings down Alexander Hamilton, and he does that with a sexual scandal, proving that he had an illicit correspondence with another man's wife. Hamilton tries to respond to this and publishes a pamphlet which muddies the water even further and makes it worse, and he's ruined by this scandal. He never holds public office again. Now that's interesting because before Callender, it looked like it was possible that Alexander Hamilton would be the Federalist candidate in 1800 instead of John Adams. After Callender, it's impossible to imagine that Hamilton is a ruined man, and his career from this point on is in tatters. He's still active behind the scenes, but he's no more part of the a real power in the game. Callender is an equal opportunity slanderer. After the election, he asked Jefferson to give him, he goes to jail under the Sedition Act, but after the election, Jefferson pardons him. He asked Jefferson to make him postmaster of Richmond, but Jefferson doesn't do it, doesn't give it. And then he turns on Jefferson, and he breaks the Sally Hemings story. He is the one that publishes that Jefferson has got a black concubine and has had 5 children with her, with Dusky Sally, as he calls her, an equal opportunity slanderer. Now, as much as anyone, the Sedition Act of 1798 was passed to get Callender. And it does. It jails him, it puts him in jail, he's in jail until after the election. it turns out to be a disaster for the Federalists because the backlash against the Sedition Act cost them one key state. The Republicans go to town on this, and it cost them one key state. So they lose the election because of this mistake of the Sedition Act. But why would they do it? Remember, the Federalists don't do anything without Alexander Hamilton's permission. He is the head of the Federalist Party. Why would Hamilton want to do that? Well, he's been ruined by Callender, and the normal recourse that he would have, which is to challenge the guy to a duel, is not possible with Callender. You know that Hamilton, this is what you do. When somebody slanders you in the 18th century, you challenge the guy to a duel, and if he doesn't give you an abject apology and retract the statement, you drill him through the liver. That's how it worked. Hamilton, you know, he died in a duel, but did you know it was his 11th? It was his 11th duel? But he can't challenge James Callender to a duel because he's not a gentleman. He's not a gentleman. He's a sleazeball. He's an impecunious Scotch immigrant that ekes out a miserable living by slandering important people. You can't challenge him to a duel, and that's the reason for the Alien and Sedition Act. Well, all this has been background on to the election itself.
Okay, now, what I'm about to explain to you, the election process in 1800, is a very complicated piece of business. In other words, this is heavy stuff, I know, but please pay attention. Then, as now, there was no direct vote for the president. The Electoral College did the actual voting. Though unlike now, in more than 2/3 of the states, the state legislators still, in 1800, chose the electors. There was no popular vote in most of the country. When the Constitution had been written in 1787, the assumption, the incredibly naive assumption, was that there would be no political parties, no partisan divide between Federalists and Republicans. Accordingly, there was no need for president, there was no ticket for president and vice president. Each elector would cast 2 votes, but both would be for president. In other words, their top 2 preferences to be the president of the United States. The candidate receiving the most votes would be president, and the one with the second most votes would be vice president. In the event of a tie at the top, the House of Representatives would then choose between the 2. Now, in the 1796 election, when the devolution into parties was still in its infancy, party discipline was non-existent. And the result was the electors chose Adams as president from one party and as his vice president, Thomas Jefferson from the rival party. Obviously not a desirable outcome, at least from the point of view of an efficient executive branch.
The battleground in 1800 was this. We've got 16 states shown in pink on the right. Most of what we call the United States today was in the hands of either France or Spain, foreign-controlled. 2 states are discontiguous. Massachusetts and Maine make up one state. Maine is still part of Massachusetts. And this little chunk of what is today Ohio belongs to Connecticut, is what called the Connecticut Western Reserve.
Okay, there were then 16 states with 138 electoral votes. As we've seen, the election in 1796 had pretty much broken down along regional lines, with Adams getting most of his support from the north and Jefferson from the south and the Republican majority in Pennsylvania. Adams' margin of victory had come from 3 electoral votes he'd been able to pick up in the Republican states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina, giving the result Adams 71, Jefferson 68. But 4 years later, in 1800, Pennsylvania had a staunchly Federalist legislature, which could be expected to give all of its 15 votes to Adams. Maryland, as befits its border state location, was now split 50-50. Federalists had managed modest inroads in the South, picking up 4 electoral votes each in Virginia and North Carolina. So the preliminary breakdown between Federalists and Republicans suggested a runaway victory for John Adams. But not so fast, because in Richmond,
meanwhile, Virginia Governor James Monroe has been looking at these 4 votes in his Republican state that are going to be taken away, because there are still some Federalists in the state government, that are going to be taken away by the Federalists, and he asks himself the following question: why is it that Virginia is a proportionate representation state instead of a winner-take-all state? A lot of the other states are winner-take-all. He looks it up and he sees it's just a law, a regular garden variety majority rule law that makes Virginia a proportionate state, so he undoes it. He calls the Virginia House of Delegates. They pass the law making Virginia a winner-take-all state. It passes the Senate, and Monroe signs it, wiping away with a stroke of the pen 4 Federalist votes and narrowing the lead that Adams has over Jefferson. Meanwhile, in New York,
if the Virginian Republican James Monroe understood the potential for manipulating the electoral process, his Republican colleague in New York, Aaron Burr, understood the nitty-gritty of turning out the popular vote. Based on the 1796 election, it was obvious to seasoned observers, and Aaron Burr was very much one of these, that New York was a key state, perhaps the key state. Certainly if the Federalists could retain the control of New York State legislature, Adams would definitely be reelected. If the Republicans could gain control, it would cut deeply into Adams' chances. Burr set out to make that happen by swinging New York City behind the Republicans. In effect, he created the first modern political machine organized out of his Nassau Street headquarters. He created subcommittees in each ward of the city, organized a highly effective fundraising effort. Even in 1800, money was important. And he arranged carriages and wagons on the day of the vote to get voters to the polls. And Burr and his Republican colleagues won. Burr had caught on to the possibilities offered by the new democratic politics that was taking shape in urban America. It was these insights, not intrigue, that meant that Jefferson, who a few days earlier seemed to have no chance of winning the presidency from Adams, was suddenly very much in the battle. But meanwhile, in Pennsylvania,
remember Mac told you that the Federalists had control of the state legislature, and therefore Adams was counting on getting all of Pennsylvania's 15 votes. But in order to give him the votes, they have to survive the October state elections, and they don't. The Federalists can't hold on because of the Sedition Act. The backlash against the Sedition Act turns the Federalists out of the lower house and leaves them in control of the upper house, state house now, the state Assembly and the state Senate, by 1 vote. So the 2 houses are split, and the way Pennsylvania votes, the concurrence of both houses is required to vote at all. The Republicans realize they can simply veto the vote, have Pennsylvania cast a no vote, which would deny Adams all of those 15 votes, which would leave us here with Jefferson moving into the lead. But meanwhile, in New York,
at Hamilton Grange, his lavish estate in Upper Manhattan, Alexander Hamilton, already outfoxed by Aaron Burr's political coup in Hamilton's own backyard, was doubly distraught by the news coming out of Pennsylvania. In a few brief months, Hamilton, the Federalist champion par excellence, had watched as Federalist President Adams' apparently, really unassailable lead had not just eroded, but disappeared. But Hamilton wasn't about to see his Federalist Party defeated by Jefferson without a fight. So Hamilton composed what is now considered an infamous letter to his friend and colleague, John Jay, who was the Federalist governor of New York, in which Hamilton proposed that Jay convene the New York State legislature in order to have it change New York from a winner-take-all state to a proportionate one, which would mean the Federalists would get nearly half of New York's electoral votes. In his letter to Governor Jay, Hamilton denounced Jefferson, we've heard all this before, quote, as an atheist in religion, a fanatic in politics, seeking the overthrow of the government or revolution after the manner of Bonaparte. And Hamilton justified the extreme action he was proposing, changing the rules after the fact, by noting that in times like these, it will not do to be over-scrupulous, to sacrifice the substantial interests of society by a strict adherence to ordinary rules. Governor Jay, to his considerable credit, not only refused to consider Hamilton's proposal, he didn't deign to reply, writing in the margin of Hamilton's letter that Hamilton was proposing a measure for party purposes which it would not become me to adopt. But in Columbia, the capital of South Carolina,
a sitting state senator at the Columbia, South Carolina State House in Columbia, a sitting state senator is one Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Revolutionary War hero, a general, and also happens to be not just someone who's voting for the Republican or Federalist ticket, but he happens to be Adams' vice presidential partner, his ticket, sharing the ticket with Adams on the Federalist line. He is part of South Carolina's allocating their, I haven't talked about the vice presidents yet, but assuming that the vice president Pinckney of the Federalists and Burr of the Republicans have the same support that their heads of their tickets have, it's now 58 to 65. And the Republicans are doing well, and South Carolina's 8 votes are definitely in the Republican camp, so they're all going to vote for Jefferson. But now here's an interesting possibility. Instead of casting their second vote for Burr, why not cast their second vote for the favorite son candidate, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and get 2 Southerners in? Regionalism trumps party. But if they do that, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney all of a sudden has more votes than Thomas Jefferson. And this guy you've never heard of is suddenly nosing into the lead, not to become vice president, but to become president. But meanwhile, back in Pennsylvania.
At the State House in Pennsylvania's temporary capital of Lancaster, realizing that their inaction was cutting the state out of any role in the 1800 election, the legislature had reconvened, and after much haggling had reached a compromise, agreeing to split their 15 electoral votes between the 2 parties, with the extra vote going to the Republicans. So if it stays like this, the Republican challenger Jefferson and South Carolina's Federalist favorite son are tied. But back in South Carolina,
General Pinckney is going through a disastrous week because what they're asking of him sounds dishonorable, and he's a very honorable man, and he's been thinking about this, and it's been very upsetting to him. He's lost some hair and lost some weight. And he finally decides not to give his good name to this scurrilous scheme. He withdraws his support for the idea and says, no vote may be cast for me except as part of an Adams-Pinckney ticket. Well, in South Carolina, there are no votes for an Adams-Pinckney ticket, so we're back to this, with Jefferson in the lead over Pinckney. Back to this, with Jefferson in the lead over Adams and Pinckney.
Now, remember, the results that we wait up for on election night in those days took weeks, even months. So what was going on in Pennsylvania was not known when the electors were casting their votes in South Carolina. What was happening there, meanwhile, was not known in Rhode Island.
So meanwhile, in Providence, Rhode Island, at the old Rhode Island State House, it is now December 3rd, 1800. The electors have been chosen. All 4 electors are chosen as Federalists. Rhode Island is a staunch Federalist state. All 4 electors are chosen as Federalists. They give their first vote to John Adams, of course. But their second vote works a little differently. 3 of them give their second vote to Pinckney, which is part of the ticket. And the 4th one, keep your eye on elector number 4, because he drops his vote. He doesn't give it to Pinckney. He gives his second vote to John Jay. Why is that? Well, because they don't know what's happening in the other states. They still expect that Adams and Pinckney may be winners, and it's absolutely essential that they not be tied. What a disaster that would be. So he drops his vote, leaving the Federalist vote 65 to 64, so that they won't be tied on the theory that they may win. Well, I certainly hope the Republicans had the good sense to do the same. Oops, they didn't. They knew what they had to do, but they dropped the ball, and they didn't throw away a vote. And the result, when it's opened in the Senate in February 11th, 1801, this is the written record by the clerk of the Senate. It's got 73 votes for Jefferson and 73 for his vice presidential candidate partner, Aaron Burr. We have a constitutional crisis on our hands.
Here we are, Thomas Jefferson and his presumptive vice president, Aaron Burr, tied for the presidency. An entirely avoidable crisis, but crisis it was. It's a real train wreck. According to the Constitution, a tie required the election to be tossed to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, each state gets to cast one vote to break the deadlock. But the winner would have to have a clear majority, not just 50%. You'd have to have 50% plus one. As there were 16 states in those days, this meant that the winning candidate needed 9 votes. Now, at this point, the action moves to the U.S. Capitol, where the lame duck House had set up its temporary headquarters. Republicans were in control in 8 state delegations, which accordingly cast all their votes for Jefferson. 6 states had a Federalist majority, so they cast their votes for Burr. It was between Jefferson and Burr. Adams was out of the picture, obviously with the express purpose of preventing Jefferson from becoming president. The other 2 states, Maryland and Vermont, were split evenly between Federalists and Republicans, so they were unable to agree who to vote for.
Mac, let me interject here. I didn't mention this earlier, but the State House in South Carolina is totally Republican, but the Washington delegation, the delegates to the House, they're left over from the election 4 years ago, and they are still Federalists.
So in the end, what you end up with is 8 votes for Jefferson, 6 for Burr. Now remember, with only 8 votes, Jefferson does not have the required majority, and the whole presidential election was deadlocked. Over a 3-day period, in the second week of February 1801, and that's less than a month, probably 3 weeks before John Adams' presidency was to end, which was on March 4th of 1801. The House voted 35 different times, and each time the result was the same. Now, as you might imagine, such a deadlock provided the opportunity for an enormous amount of mischief, and not just from the Federalists. Burr, like everyone else, knew that Jefferson was the proposed president for their party, for his party, and he, Burr, the vice president. But with the deadlock, Burr realized if he could swing a deal with some of the Federalists in the House, he would end up as president, not Jefferson. And of course, the Federalists knew that though there was no way they could get Adams elected, re-elected, if they were to negotiate a deal with Burr that made him president rather than Jefferson, it would destroy the Republican Party. It would split it in 2 and mean that the real party in Washington would be retained by the Federalists. And there were other possibilities the Federalists were exploring. If they kept the House deadlocked until Adams stepped down in early March, since they controlled Congress, they could then, the Federalists, appoint an interim president, at least until the new Congress was sworn in the following fall. And anything could happen during those 6 months. Now, James Monroe, who was the Republican governor of Virginia, teamed up with the Republican governor of Pennsylvania, and the 2 were threatening to move their militias onto Washington to prevent this maneuver. So it was a highly combustible time. While Burr did keep his options open, which was to create permanent bad blood between him and Jefferson, in the end, he turned out to be not quite the opportunist or intriguer that Washington had portrayed him as. It's clear Burr was in touch with some of the Federalists, and they could have swung the vote to him, but he never made a deal with them. So there's no written proof. Historians now agree that Jefferson was also negotiating with the Federalists, and he did make a deal, accepting the following three conditions dictated by Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson would retain the national bank Hamilton had set up a decade earlier. He would not disband the Navy, which had grown substantially under Adams, nor would he fire Federalists from the government jobs they had been appointed to under Adams. The Hamilton-Jefferson deal gave Jefferson the majority he needed, and he became our third president. One final footnote, Jefferson did indeed keep his word on the deal he made with Hamilton that made him president.
March 4th, 1801, a peaceful transition between two bitterly rival countries, something that the world had, two bitterly rival parties, something that the world had never seen before, a miracle at the time. It's still a miracle when it happens today. In order to call attention to this willingness to transfer power, Jefferson writes to Chief Justice John Marshall, who happens to be his cousin. They hate each other, by the way. He writes him a letter asking him to officiate over the inauguration. Now, that happens routinely today, that the Chief Justice officiates or administers the oath of office, but there was no tradition for that at the time. But John Marshall does agree, and he does give the oath of office to Jefferson in the Senate chamber, which is still there. You can see it's not used as a Senate chamber anymore, but it's still there in the Capitol. You can see that today. The day is marred by four less than wonderful things. First of all, Adams doesn't show. Adams is bitter about the result. He leaves town. He catches the 4 a.m. stage, the public stage north, on his way back to Quincy. He has no intention of seeing his rival take over the office of presidency. The second thing is, this is hard to visualize, but according to the history books, Marshall administers the oath of office to Jefferson with his back to Jefferson. So he's got the Bible here in his hand, and I don't know how he did it, but somehow he does that. Now, the third less than wonderful thing, Jefferson gives a deplorable inaugural address. Well, we have the inaugural address in written form. It's not so terrible, but nobody can hear what he says. He mumbles through it, and even the people in the front row can't hear him, and they all wander out saying, well, what was that all about? And then the fourth thing is that the margin of victory is less than the black vote. Jefferson has won, but only by virtue of the 10 black votes voted by white people. So he starts out on a note of terrific illegitimacy, that it's only slavery that has given him the presidency in 1800. That's the low point. From that point on, things click for Jefferson as had never been seen before or since. It's the most successful first term of any president in American history. When he stands for re-election in 1804, it's not a squeaker, it's a landslide. What has he done to so convert the American people as to explain this difference? Well, first of all, he passes the 12th Amendment, which makes it impossible forever after this confusion between whether people were voting for president or vice president. With the 12th Amendment, you vote for a ticket of president and vice president. One ticket wins and the other ticket loses, and then the president and vice president of that ticket take office. That's the 12th Amendment. He keeps the national bank, as he promised. Very key thing, because the economy explodes in the first Jefferson term. This is Hamilton's vision for the way the national bank was to help the economy prosper, but nobody has had the result of it as much as Jefferson did. The Industrial Revolution starts to happen in the United States. Credit is easy, the currency is stable, and the economy explodes. And now he does three really surprising things. He eliminates all taxes on the individual. All of the excise taxes are wiped out. Second, he pays off almost the entire national debt. And third, he finishes with a surplus. Now, how does he do that? Mitt Romney, pay attention here. How does he do it? He buys Louisiana. He buys 828,000 square miles for $3.75 million, the price of a house in Camden. He buys land for less than $4 a square mile, and he sells it for many times more than that to settlers moving from the east into the west, buying up land. He funds his entire administration with the windfall profits on this land deal. Both terms, 8 years under Jefferson, funds all of Madison, 8 years, all of Monroe, 8 years, all of John Quincy Adams, 4 years, and all of the beginning of Andrew Jackson, the first term of Andrew Jackson. All of this with the windfall profits from his land deal. When James Madison goes to France to sign the deal with Talleyrand, Talleyrand says, "You have made yourselves a fine bargain." Of course it's a fine bargain. It's a distressed sale. Napoleon is broke. Napoleon has lost almost his whole fleet in the Battle of the Nile. Nelson has wiped out the French fleet. So Napoleon can no longer project a navy into the New World. He decides to get rid of it and reap what he can for money to conduct his wars. So it is a fine bargain indeed. Jefferson, it's an act of tremendous political courage to do what Jefferson did, because he's got no constitutional cover to buy Louisiana. The Constitution simply doesn't give him that power, as he has never ceased repeating to Hamilton the words of the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated by the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. You can't do anything that the Constitution doesn't give you the right to do. But he looks at it hard and cold, and he decides to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. It's what made him, I think, a great president, maybe our greatest, Thomas Jefferson. This is the point where we ask Mac what the hell it all means. In particular, what does it mean to us in the 21st century?
Yeah, and what does the election of 1800 have to do with the election of 2012? Well, interestingly, while a lot of things have changed since 1800, some things have not. In particular, if the Electoral College vote were tied, it would still get thrown to the House. And it's quite possible in our election on Tuesday, the Electoral College vote could be tied. Let's look at some political analysts' best guess of where the electoral vote is now. That's where they think it is now. At the bottom you see 269. You've got to get more than 269 votes to win. The states solidly for Romney are in red, those for Obama in blue, the others too close to call, the so-called swing states. Now, if the swing states were to split a certain way, Florida, Ohio, Colorado, Iowa, Nevada to Obama, and the others to Romney, each candidate would end up with 269 electoral votes. Or they could be split another way, with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and Colorado going to Obama, and the rest to Romney. And again, each candidate would end up with 269 votes. So it's not an entirely far-fetched possibility. Such a tied vote now as in 1800, or indeed were you to have an election in the future in which a third party kept either major party from getting 270 electoral votes, would end up in the House. Each state would have but one vote. So California, the most populous state in the Union, gets one vote, as does Wyoming, the least populous. Now, if you look at which party controls the House delegations in each state today, it's 30 Republican states, 20 Democratic ones. It's not even close. A tie in the Electoral College vote, regardless, of course, of the popular vote, would make Mitt Romney the next president. But wait, that's the easy part. According to the 12th Amendment, the 12th Amendment was passed in 1804 as a result of the election crisis of 1800, which we've just spent the past 100 minutes talking about. While the House, in effect, gets to choose the president, the Senate, in the event of a tie, gets to choose the vice president. And the voting would take place before the new Congress is sworn in which case, with 53 Democratic senators and a 269 electoral tie, Mitt Romney's vice president would be Joe Biden. And with that thought, we will leave you.
And it's true.